know you can do better than that. Houston. Okay, there we go. Nashville, Maryland, Toronto. Amazing, amazing, amazing. For our regulars, it's great to have you back. For those of you that are new to your Brain at Work Live, welcome to the party. For some context, it is the title of one of the best-selling books by our CEO and co-founder, Dr. David Rock, and it's also the name of our blog and podcast. We are recording today's session, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. That email is going to include a survey for feedback, as well as a number of resources that are aligned to today's conversation. Now, as far as sharing slides, we reserve that for our current clients and corporate members only. However, if you're interested in becoming one, let us know in the chat. We also suggest putting your phones away, going on Do Not Disturb, so you can get the most out of today's discussion, but it'll also help with your audio and video quality. And as always, we love the chat. We want to have your interaction, so please share your comments and thoughts with us. Now, as we get ready to kick off, grab some coffee, water, get settled in as we dive deeper into our SCARF model. But before we do that, as always, let's introduce our speakers for today. You know him well, an Aussie turned New Yorker who coined the term neuroleadership when he co-founded NLI over 2 decades ago, with a professional doctorate, 4 successful books under his name, and a multitude of bylines ranging from the Harvard Business Review to New York Times and many more. A warm welcome to our co-founder and CEO of the Neuroleadership Institute, Dr. David Rock. Great to have you, David.
Shelby, great to have the time together to talk about this. Thanks for everything that you do here.
Yes. And our moderator for today's discussion has 20 years of organizational transformation, culture change, and leadership consulting experience. His work spans across the globe in North America, South America, Canada, Europe, and Africa. This includes CEOs and senior leaders from organizations such as NASA, Aerospace, the Federal Government of Canada, Royal Bank of Canada, T-Mobile, World Bank, and Microsoft. He is also a lecturer at Simon Fraser University, where he teaches the neurosciences of business management to fourth-year business students. A warm welcome as I pass the virtual mic to our Director of Keynote Speaking at the Neuroleadership Institute, Matt Summers. Matt, great to have you here for the first time, and over to you.
Well, Shelby, thank you so much. It's a very generous introduction for David and I, and welcome everyone to your Brain at Work. It's a pleasure to be with you. So folks, today what we're going to do is we're really going to explore and take a deeper dive into the SCARF model. And we're going to hear more about where it came from, how it developed, and really the research behind it, as David and I talk in a fireside chat type of style of dialogue, really understanding what's behind the SCARF model. So David, why don't we dive right in? And what I'm curious about, and I'm sure what a lot of our audience is curious about, what is this model firstly, so that we can create a baseline for everyone who's joining us? Some are very familiar with it, others may be hearing about it for the first time. But, what is this model firstly?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Look, it's something that's used in so many different ways, as you'll hear about. So it's kind of hard to define it without telling the whole story. But just from a practical perspective, it's a framework of 5 different ideas. And SCARF spells out status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. 5 different ideas, each one of which can be either a strong threat response in the brain. So status, for example, if someone says, can I give you some feedback? You get a strong status threat in the brain. But they can also be activating a reward response. Generally tends to be less intense, right? Bad is stronger than good. So there's sort of a couple of different axes. There's the 5 different words, and then each one can be, negative or positive. And essentially it's describing what's going on in our brain during social interactions. These are the 5 things the brain is tracking using completely different networks, completely different processes. But it's kind of the primary colors of what goes on in our brain while we interact with other humans. So it's kind of broad.
Yeah, David, thank you for giving us that outline. Can we talk a little bit more deeper around, the psychological domains you're referring, the 5 domains of SCARF? There's a primary brain, like the brain has a primary organizing principle. Can you tell us a bit more about that threat and reward primary organizing principle so people can understand it at a deep level?
Yeah, I mean, we could spend an hour just on that, so I'll try not to go too deep, but essentially the kind of overarching structure of how the brain kind of creates behavior is, at its core, is like, should I do more of something or less of something? And like in every way. Should I drink more of this drink, less of this drink? Should I do more of these emails, less of these emails? Should I listen more to these sounds or less to these sounds? And this kind of more or less function is driving all of our behavior in every single domain. And it's actually spooky because it's the behavior at a neuronal level where literally cells are like firing more or firing less, right? And they call it a BIS-BAS system, a behavioral inhibition system like fire less, or a behavioral activation system, fire more. But then it works at the level of neuronal groups and then whole brain behavior, individual behavior, team behavior, company behavior, planetary behavior. So, all of human behavior is in one of these two kind of gears, more of or less of, and we call it toward and away, just because it's kind of what you see. You literally see people in particular being in a toward state or an away state. And as I mentioned, the sort of negative is stronger, but essentially what SCARF does is describe the things that create those strong reactions in either direction, because generally we feel most passionate about things that are social and have to do with a social environment, right? And the reason for that is pretty simple. We survive through other people till we're about a dozen years old. We don't survive by, finding food at night, like some animals will do, hours after they're born. We survive for more than a decade by knowing who to trust and not to trust, right? And by being, our parents' favorite. And so the brain's really has these big networks devoted to these social drivers and social domains. And what SCARF does is kind of pulls apart what the brain is tracking socially to help us stay alive. That's fundamentally, what it's doing.
Yeah, David, I'm hearing, that it's giving us this common sense, this common language that we can use as humans in these social interactions to create pro-social engagement. David, as I listen to you, what's occurring for me is that what I'm hearing is that threat and reward are on a continuum. Is that correct, in the human brain? And so, that it's like a pendulum swinging. We can be in social contexts where we're in a toward state, and you may say or do something that then creates maybe a threat trigger that puts this then pendulum swing or this continuum into more of a threat state. So when you talk about this primary organizing principle of the brain is to minimize threat, and what I'm hearing is we minimize threat first before we maximize reward. Is that correct?
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways to answer that. Like firstly, the threat is stronger than reward. So if you're sitting in a scanner and they're showing you different pictures, a square and then a circle and then a cow and then an angry face and then a pie and then a rabbit and then a happy face, generally the angry face will light up more than anything else, and the happy face will light up your brain a bit, but the angry face will light up your brain faster, more intensely, and last longer than the happy face. The rabbit might light it up a little bit if it's cute, but the happy face will light it up more. So basically, we're more attuned to the negative, and in particular when it's social, like it's a face versus a rabbit, it activates more. So it's not even though it sounds binary, there's really we occur across all the different points on the toward away spectrum. And at the start of the pandemic, we talked a lot about the threat response, and we talked a lot about the 3 different intensities of threat. I won't go into that too far, but essentially a little bit of threat's not a bad thing. It's actually good for focusing and being productive, not good for creative things, but a little threat's not bad. The problem is when you get multiple things kind of causing threat, and that often happens when you have multiple SCARF domains. We can get into that later, but essentially what SCARF does is it gives you this ability to understand ahead of time what how to minimize threat, which is important because it's so strong in yourself or others. Ahead of time. You can also do it in real time, or you can do it after the fact. There's sort of a before, during, and after capacity it gives you, because you know what it is that's creating strong threat. So it's kind of giving you the primary colors, or I think of almost the graphic equalizer of tuning up your interactions in that way.
Okay, thanks, David. I think that's really helpful for not only myself, but for the listeners here, and just understanding some of that backstory. Now, talking about that backstory, if you can tell us a little bit about, like, how did the idea of SCARF maybe first emerge? Like, what was part of that journey for you?
Yeah. No, let's go back. I think it's good to tell the story a bit. look, so there's a longer story, but I've been fabulous. Like I've just been sort of obsessed with this fabulous thing called the brain. It's so funny. My daughter Trinity is now 18, just has gone to college in London and studying psychology, and she's like, "You'll never guess what, Dad? I'm learning about the brain, and it's so interesting." I'm like, "Oh God!" It was like such a wonderful moment.
It's in the gene pool there, David.
And I had to like not get too excited, so I didn't like, steer her away. It's like, yeah, it's really interesting. So anyway, so I've been really fascinated with the brain for the longest time, literally since I was like younger than she is now, and had read personally a lot and really kind of studied it privately. And I started to include it kind of by accident. I started to include general brain research kind of by accident when I went on faculty at NYU around 2002, 2003. And I was building these coaching programs in partnership with NYU. I built their certificate programs. And because it was NYU, we wanted to have a good theory. And I basically was rereading a bunch of texts at the time. I think it was A User's Guide to the Brain by John Ratey. And I thumbed that book so much and marked it so much. And over the years, I must have read it 3 or 4 times. And I remember actually being in this class, having an insight, a really strong insight, going, wow, it'd be really helpful to kind of frame all the stuff that we're doing in coaching from a neuroscience perspective. It would kind of explain things. And the next class, we were sort of running a lot of classes all the time. In the next class, I had like 70 something people, and I just gave a handout to everyone with 2 or 3 different quotes. And I watched what happened in the room, and it was like the entire energy changed. It was like an afternoon, like day 2 or 3 of a long program in an awfully ventilated, poorly lit room. Thanks, NYU. And the whole room suddenly lit up. And I was just watching all these people popping, making connections between things. And that moment literally sparked my like absolute obsession with like, there's something here to understand the neuroscience. And what happened was I started to really, really study it by just reaching out to anyone that would kind of talk to me and interviewing them and writing about it and kind of trying to incorporate things into the program. Basically, that's where I started. It's trying to put together a more unified theory of how, the brain works as it relates to coaching people at the time. Because it was just so helpful to explain in real time, what was happening in the brain of someone you were coaching. It just made coaching so much clearer, better, more powerful, more tangible, more effective, right? So I sort of got on this rant, and a bit of a sidetrack. I ended up building a whole textbook based on what we developed. It's called Coaching with the Brain in Mind. It's still out there. It's used by a bunch of schools, but essentially I built that for NYU so that we didn't have to have 2,000 pages of handouts, showing how the brain kind of was a bridging factor between systems theory, learning theory, positive psychology, change theory, all these things. Anyway, back to the main story. So that sort of kicked off my journey. And what happened was I started interviewing all these different scientists that seemed to be kind of central to, interacting with people. So I'm not so obsessed with, the breaking down of synapses into the different components, or, the 50 different chemicals that are going across the synapses. I mean, there's so much amazing stuff about the brain, but I was interested in the stuff you could see, or the stuff you could observe, not see, that you could observe in human behavior. And right about that time, social cognitive affective neuroscience was kind of kicking off. And they was doing the first studies of what happens when brains interact. And it was sort of the computing power had got good enough to do this, and enough kind of machines had gone out there. And so it was this wonderful opportunity to kind of talk to these people. And I kept running into the same story over and over from about a dozen different scientists. And there was all sorts of, Matt Lieberman, I spent some time with, Kevin Oxner, but a number of others. And they all kept saying, it's really curious. We're looking at people's brains, they're from MRI, and we're really surprised to see that, the network that lights up when you are giving someone money or experiencing physical pleasure is lighting up when they just feel treated fairly in an ultimatum game or something. It's like, we don't understand it. How's it happening? And someone else would say, it's really strange that the network that activates when you experience physical pain, is lighting up when someone feels left out of an activity. It's like really quirky. And honestly, I heard this same story. It must have been like 20 or 30 different labs, different studies, different scenarios of like, something's really going on here. And it set off actually set off a 3-year journey to try to scratch an itch that was just really bugging me. And the itch was like, you know, there's some pattern here that could be helpful. And I knew it anchored on threat and reward early on. And it had a number of different models that in the early days, there was kind of CARS before I really saw the centrality of fairness. There was ARCS at one point, ARCS. There's a couple of different things we're going to try it out. And I spent a lot of time talking to different scientists about what am I missing and does this work and how, you know, testing it out. But over about 3 years, we tried lots of things. And then it's a funny story, but it all came together for me at this very odd moment. I had what some of you might understand as a level 5 insight. Like a level 5 insight changes your life forever. This is probably the strongest level 5 insight I've ever had. And I was in the Philippines, and I was there to have a meeting with a client at the time. It was Ericsson. We were doing this work with them about, you know, quality conversations and how to really talk, you know, more openly and really. But so I was there to have this meeting, and while I was there at this hotel, I'm sorry, the story's getting a bit long, but while I was there, it was this, you know, beautiful hotel, and there's this huge kind of patchwork next to the front door. And I'm like, why is there, you know, are you guys doing some renovations? And like, no one would kind of answer me, like why there was this giant sort of renovations next to the front door. And eventually, like the third or fourth person I asked said, yeah, that's where the tanks tried to come through a few weeks ago. And I'm like, what? And they said, yeah, no, there was this attempted coup because people felt like really treated unfairly in the army about some, you know, such and such and such and such. And I'd been thinking a lot about fairness from some other stuff that I'd been reading, and I was, you know, deeply reading the literature on social things. And at some point I was actually, this is kind of awkward, but it's the truth. I was literally like, you know, on my day off, you know, meeting the next day in the swimming pool, and I dived right to the bottom of the pool. It's quite deep, like they use it for you know, dive training. I was right at the bottom of the swimming pool, kind of about halfway along, and suddenly my brain exploded, and I literally had the word scarf come into my head. And because the F was the missing piece, and just it came from my unconscious, and I had to come straight up and ran back to my room, looked it up, and looked up like, what is it and how would it work, and spent like weeks and weeks and weeks testing if this would, you know, be a concept. And then, you know, from that point on, started to talk about it. So that was probably like 2000, I'm not sure exactly. It's probably 2006, somewhere in there. And then we published it in 2008 after a lot of trial and error and testing.
That's an interesting space to have a level 5 insight there, David, at the bottom of the depths of a pool. It's fairly uncommon for most of us. It's when we're in the shower or when we're deep asleep. So David, thank you. As you talk about the origins of the SCARF model, I'm curious in that evolution, how did then it all start to come together? Once you had that insight of, hey, we've got SCARF, I know that you started to put together a number of series of publications. How did tell us a bit about that evolution?
Yeah, so we published, it took a while. So whenever I have a kind of what feels like a big idea, I never feel very confident with it. And I don't really know if an idea really is impactful for a few years, to be honest. And when it sort of first came together, I'd start talking about it at conferences and start kind of presenting it to leaders and start kind of discussing it. But it took a while. We published the first paper in 2008 in the first journal, the first Neuro Leadership journal. Had some amazing papers in that one. Not I'm saying that was amazing, but there's some really foundational papers for our field in that very first journal. It was exciting to publish it. And we were sort of trying to work out like what it is and how to use it. And we can talk more about that. But the second thing that we published was 2012 in a journal, literally 4 years later in our own journal, where we actually dug into the different ways that you can use it. And we articulated a couple of central ideas around kind of that you can use it before, during, or after interactions, right? So before an interaction, you can plan better. You can imagine the interaction you're going to have and say, oh, if I say, why did you do that? I'm probably messing with their status. So what could I do differently, right? So before an interaction, you can kind of plan better. And that's something that's really important. During an interaction, you can see, something that's going on, and you can go, oh, I've just created, say a fairness response in someone, and do that. And then the other thing that we laid out there is what we call the offsetting and multiplying effect, or multiplying and offsetting effect, which is that we realized that these scarf domains kind of make each other worse or balance each other out. And the metaphor that I've got now is a kind of a seesaw. I've sort of got clear in the last year or so, is that each of the domains is like a weight on a seesaw, right? And I picture a giant seesaw. I may actually build a giant seesaw on some land I've got up north now, and so we could actually do this physically. But if you imagine a weight on the left of the seesaw that's a threat response, right? For say status, so that the S is a big weight, you've got a small s on the right, you could balance that with. So what happens is if you get on a Zoom call with a colleague and basically fire them unfairly out of the blue, you're impacting status, obviously, but also, huge impact on their sense of certainty, a huge impact on their sense of autonomy or control. They have no control, no recourse. They're suddenly losing all their friends, that sense of relatedness, and you've done it unfairly, so it's impacting fairness, right? You can imagine that really upsets people, right? Or if you get an email from your boss or a text message like some companies did of, being fired, you get all, 5 domains, right? But so they each make each other worse. Or an example, you say to someone, why did you do that? If you just launch in and say that, it's really different to saying, hey, something happened, I'm on your side. I know we're trying to win this project together, but can you tell me why you did that, right? So you're doing relatedness first, and then you're hitting their status, but you've got some relatedness first. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is these domains either make each other worse or offset each other, mm-hmm. right? So you can, if you're going to create, say, a status threat in someone, make sure you have some relatedness, right? That they feel like you're on their side first, or make sure they have a sense of control over whether they have the conversation or not, mm-hmm. right? Which is autonomy, right? Make sure you really, so there's this seesaw. If you're going to create a threat on one side, put a reward on the other. Now, remember, threats are stronger. So you might think you're putting in a tiny threat. Well, what might look like a tiny threat to you might be a really big threat to them. Mm-hmm. You might have to put a few rewards in to balance that out, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And often, people in power in an organization often don't realize that others have much stronger emotions than they expect. And so you've really got to work hard to balance the other side of that continuum.
David, this offset and multiply effect is really interesting to me, and I'm sure it is to the listeners. My question to you is then, my intuitive approach to the scarf model would be that if someone scarfs me, right, puts me in a threat state in, let's say, fairness, and let's say that person is in a fairness threat state, surely I would just then increase the amount of fairness I give to them. That's my intuition, but the science says something different. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's been really hard to set up scenarios to study this in the lab, like directly. So mm-hmm. they're more like kind of thought experiments of scenarios and our experience. And a lot of our learned experience as adults is getting this stuff wrong and trying to find a way and build better patterns. But yeah, if you create a sense of unfairness in someone, you can't just say I'm being fair and try to treat them fairly. What you might need to do is give them a whole lot more information, which means impacting certainty.
Right.
So you might need to raise certainty to balance out fairness, right? Or if you impact, if you're going to impact someone's sense of certainty, for example, you might want to, by saying there's a whole lot of stuff changing, you might want to increase their sense of autonomy, but you've got some control over how this happens, mm-hmm. right? So if you're making something uncertain, you might increase control. So it's not a one-to-one ratio. You're trying to kind of balance it out in this way. But we'd love to work out how to do some scenarios and test these different, kind of situations out in some clever ways.
Yeah, David, I want to go to the chat. I'd love to engage the audience here if you don't mind. I see that Kath is asking, is there a matrix on the offsets for each domain? I think you've spoken to a little bit about that, but can you maybe expand that a bit, David?
Yeah, we haven't. So we use this scarf in a couple of different ways, right? So about 30% of our work with organizations is these custom big solutions, either around like all of leadership development, like we do at Microsoft, or all of DEI, as we've done another number of places. So about 30% of our work is these kind of custom, and about 70% is more off the shelf. And so in the deeper leadership programs, sometimes we'll actually spend quite a lot of time practicing the offsetting effect. Like this scenario, what would you do? This scenario, what would you do? And kind of building people's own scaffolding of that effect versus like, here's a list, go and learn it. And so we sort of shied away from being too directive about the offsetting, but we definitely can show, these are the common situations, but it's also very context dependent. So we'd rather sort of teach people a bunch of scenarios for them to be able to understand themselves, what to do in different situations.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. And Kath, great question. Thank you for bringing that up. And one of our valued partners here at the NLI. David, I'm getting some questions and something that I'm curious about and noticing in our dialogue here. I'm wondering if we can dive a little bit deeper into, add a bit more meat to the bones, if you will, to each of the domains. So we've talked about SCARF at a very high level, but why don't we just dig in a bit deeper to, when we talk about status, let's start at the top. So what is going on in the human brain unconsciously if we have a social domain preference, a psychological preference in status? And if you could go through each of those for us, so we can level set.
Sure. So let me just kind of cover something you mentioned quickly. So we did a lot of analysis in the first kind of 5-6 years with SCARF. We had some assessments that we did. We got thousands, we got more than 10,000 different data points. And what we found is that people vary in how they value the SCARF domains. So there are some people that like autonomy is everything for them. Like they just really want to be in control. They love to be in charge, and when they're not, it's often almost painful to them, right? That would be me. My strongest domain is autonomy. I try to be clear with everyone in my life that that's how I am, and feel free to run away. But if you want to collaborate with me, that's just kind of what makes me tick. And there's other people I meet that are completely different, right? I have people on my team who it's not about autonomy, it's all about certainty. They really, really want things laid out. They want things really clear. Now I've got to pay extra attention to how I interact with those people, because I naturally assume they've got my brain, right? Something we all do. And unless I'm quite deliberate, even still to this day, I'll accidentally just be too high level and, not really create certainty, right? So we all have a different SCARF order, we call it. And the way you so one of the uses of SCARF is the way we interact with others, right? So if you're a parent, go ask your kids which SCARF domain they have. Oh, by the way, I meant to finish this earlier. The other thing we published that's meaningful, and I'll share this one because you can find it online and read it, whereas you can't find our journal papers publicly and read them. But this one you can find and read. You can't use SCARF in a training without permission, but you totally should share it with your family and kids and team, and it's super useful. And the piece is called Managing with the Brain in Mind. It was in Strategy and Business years ago, but it's a really good summary of the model and the chunks and kind of how it works. So Managing with the Brain in Mind, my team can maybe put that in the chat, is the other thing we published that kind of walks through it. But anyway, going back to your point, so we can come back later to the other uses. One use is knowing your domain and others. But so status, what's happening with status is it's literally determining who's higher and who's lower in our social interactions. And the brain kind of obsesses about that. There's a lot of different things that kick in when you're the higher status person that are different to when you're the lower status person. In fact, we feel uncomfortable until we work out status when we interact with people. Once we kind of have worked out our status, which mostly happens unconsciously, we feel much better, even if we're than the uncertainty of it, even though you might be lower status, which doesn't feel great. So higher status generally is you have more positive neurochemistry like dopamine and serotonin and other things. So higher status is this reward response. Lower status is a threat response, and it ties to concepts like dominant and submissive in interactions and authority and all. So it's got all sorts of different domains. It's slightly different to power, but similar. But essentially, we want to know the pecking order in the community we're in, and the brain keeps track of that really powerfully for a really long time. Like you could, reflect on a sports team you were in your, 30 years ago in your teenage years, like me, and you'll remember the exact status order of that team. If we show you pictures, you'll be able to like that's amazing data, but to be held for so long. So we all, it's very, very important data. It tends to be encoded without effort. So status data is kind of automatic, and then we remember it. We meet someone that's higher status for us, we talk to them for 10 minutes, don't see them for a decade. When we run into them again, we'll unconsciously feel that they're the more important person. Like it's without any effort, just deeply encoded. So a lot of, I'm spending maybe too much time on status, but there's a lot of money is made trying to, sell people things that raise their status marker. Let's say clothes, makeup, shoes, cars, houses, because it feels good to feel higher status. It doesn't feel good to be lower status. There's a whole world. So there's a whole different set of brain processes that happen when you are, and it's basically, based on looking at faces. You look at a face and you kind of decide pretty quickly. So certainty is the brain essentially mapping into the future, right? So we're constantly predicting what's going to happen at every level of complexity, from holding a glass to where am I going tonight to what am I doing in career, going forward. And we hold these maps for being able to predict what's happening, so we don't have to kind of think. So that, as Jeff Hawkins says, that the brain's a prediction machine. It's constantly predicting. And when you are sitting down at your desk and you go to reach for your coffee that's always in the same spot, you don't have to use working memory to work out where it is. You're more efficient, you can focus on your projects, right? And then you go to reach your coffee, it's not there, you just put it there 10 minutes ago, where is it gone? You're suddenly uncertain. This uncertainty gets a lot of attention until it's kind of collapsed, right? So uncertainty gets a lot of attention in the brain. It activates a threat response. It feels kind of painful. It activates a similar network to physical pain. All the negatives do. And so certainty is you trying to predict constantly. And so we're predicting around everything, every single sense and thought. There's this prediction into the future. And what happens, if you thought you were going out tonight, sorry, someone is here. I don't know why. There shouldn't be anyone.
That's
here.
okay, David. While you're doing that, what I might do is just to give you a pause there. As we talk about certainty, folks, what's occurring for me too is the context of the last 2.5 years of the pandemic, right? So a lot of the work we've been doing with clients, and what I find really interesting about what David's saying here in connection to what I tell my students at the university I teach at is, what's the human condition in the SCARF model of these psychological domains of certainty, and how's that affecting our thinking, our social interactions, our behaviors with others, if we're in a state of threat or insular self-reflective space of protecting ourselves? So David, I'm referring to this concept of certainty during the time of the pandemic, right? Can you maybe make some comments and some of the conversations you've had with CEOs and leaders in the space of certainty of pandemic?
Yeah, no, I mean, the challenge with the pandemic is every level of certainty got attacked. Where am I going to live? Am I, people around me going to live? Am I am I, what's going to happen with my job? What's going to happen with my finances? What's going to happen with staying sane, living with my partner and children? Pretty much everything became uncertain, right? And then now, as we move into this kind of new phase where companies are trying to bring people back, it's this whole other level of uncertainty that's really hitting.
Yeah, and David, what I might do too is I might move us forward into then the next category of autonomy, if you don't mind. Knowing that autonomy in the human space, and I'll hand this over to you, but really this autonomy is having this ability to do our best work. Do I have a certain sense of choice and control in the social interaction, in this project, in this conversation, in this decision? Tell us a bit more about that, David.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really tricky. So I'm a little distracted. I've got my house is being renovated. Speaking of uncertainty, this is classic. So I'm in another place where
being human, David, is totally okay.
They're saying I'm supposed to be checking out today, half an hour ago. I'm like, no, it's Sunday. I'm 90% sure it's Sunday. That's what's going on in the background. So, these things are really debilitating. But, going to hybrid and kind of this world, we're trying to map forward, will I go to the office these days? What will that be like? How safe will it be? Could I get, COVID again with this, new one? Who will be there? How will I work on the other days? Your brain's mapping forward. trying to work out like all these different scenarios. And when you can't work it out, each one of these becomes this like noise that this really big noise in the brain. It's like it's this incomplete puzzle. It's called the Zeigarnik effect. So every one of these becomes kind of more noise. And, you know, from an organization's perspective, the more you can kind of tick these boxes for people, the less noise that they'll have, and the more people will be able to really, you know, really move forward. So we've been saying a lot, you know, you can't create certainty necessarily as an organization, especially, you can't necessarily create certainty, but you can create a proxy for certainty, which is an increase in the amount of clarity people have. Right. So you might not be able to tell them exactly what's going to happen, but you can say, look, here's the process we're using to make the decision, or here's the steps, or, you know, who's been involved in the process. So you can create a greater sense of clarity. We actually wrote a piece about that, 3 ways to create clarity. We kind of articulated the 3 different ways you can create clarity about clarity, and help people see it. So that's something to really focus on in this time, I think.
David, I want to pause you. I want to just notice and name something. Let's be human for just a moment. We're getting some comments in the chat box from, you know, folks like Mark and Alistair and others. Just noticing what just happened to you in that moment, talking about certainty and uncertainty and threat responses and the impact on cognitive function there, David. We can all relate to those situations when we're trying to access that conscious thinking and, you know, logical thought. And when we get hijacked, right, by that amygdala, that emotional side of distraction, it generates that uncertainty. So just want to notice you're being human there, David, and we can relate to that on probably a daily occurrence for all of us. So thank you for demonstrating that.
Yeah. And
we didn't plan that, by the way, folks.
Yeah, the more you understand about why your brain's doing different things in different situations, the more you can kind of say, oh, that's just my brain doing its thing. Yeah. Right. And the less it kind of takes over, right? The more you can get some distance from a phenomena, right? And that's one of the things that SCARF does in the brain. I think it's really interesting to think about like what SCARF does in the brain, even though we're only up to certainty, because it actually relates to autonomy, which is the A. Autonomy is a feeling of control. And ironically, the more you understand about your brain, such as through SCARF, the greater sense of control you have, right? And control, you know, such an interesting one. Autonomy is such an interesting one. It plummeted in the pandemic as well. But it was also this unexpected upside, this unexpected silver lining in the pandemic of actually, I'm more in control of my work. I'm more in control of my life. I'm more in control of my diet, of who I have to run into for the introverts, right? Of how many germs I have to touch for the germaphobes, of people, you know, managing their health. I'm much more in charge of my exercise routine, my sleep routine. Like, so we actually had this greater sense of control suddenly during this time. Now, what companies don't understand right now is that, you know, it might look more certain to do like a 3-2 model of, you know, I'm in the office for 2 days, out for 3, or whichever. It might look more certain, but it plummets people's sense of autonomy. And that's one of the kind of upsides that people have. And this is why we're seeing, you know, a lot of folks voting with their feet and changing companies, you know, going to places where they feel like they can be in control of their work life. You know, our organization, we basically said a few years before the pandemic, we said, hey, folks, we're giving you all a laptop. Please come to the office if that's where you're productive. Never come if that's where you're not. Mix it up if you like. Like, find out where you're productive, make that work, negotiate with your team. You know, you're in charge. And so, and that's something a lot of other companies are now seeing as a really great way to manage. So that's the A. A is about the feeling of control. A little bit of a drop has a big effect negatively, but a little increase has a big effect positively, right? And then the R is important. The R is in group or out group. It's relatedness. It's a sense of having shared goals. So R is literally like, are we on the same team? So positive relatedness is, are we on the same team? Are we working to similar things, right? So if you sit down with your boss and he's trying to tell you that you're, you know, an underperformer, you're trying to tell him you're an overperformer, you've got competing goals, right? But if you sit down with your boss and you're both trying to work out what you learned in the last year and how to get even better, you know, more of a growth mindset approach, now you have similar goals, right? You're both going to talk about how you're going to get better. Now you're more likely to disclose your mistakes, right? And actually talk more honestly about what's happening. So relatedness is about shared goals. It's belonging is, you know, a sense of relatedness. then the F is fairness. And this is why the army, pushed through the front door. F is a sense of fairness that people have. So, and again, like all of these, it activates a strong threat response when it's in the negative. I'm going to manage this one moment while you take a question.
Yeah, no worries, David. Thank you. So folks, as David's walking us through each of the 5 domains, I'm wondering if you're having the same experience as I am, and you're starting to relate, what is my top psychological domain as David's describing them? I'll share mine, and that is relatedness. And so as a human, unconsciously, I'm having these influences of creating in-group and out-group when I'm in social interactions, working with teams or with clients. A direct story with David is when I first joined the Analyze 6 years ago, I remember meeting David in our head office in New York. And relatedness is so important to me that I didn't go straight to business talk. I pulled David aside and we started talking about something that was enabling us to find common ground. And that was in the space of snowboarding. In fact, David is an avid snowboarder, as am I, living here in British Columbia, here in Canada, close to Whistler Ski Hill. And we just talked for 30 minutes, just purely about ski resorts, about snowboarding gear, David learning how to do big jumps. And what's really interesting is by finding that relatedness connection and pulling that massive towards signal and pulling that towards reward response in our relationship early on, we continue to come back to that original conversation 6 years ago frequently. In fact, just last week, Dave and I were talking about snowboarding. So David, just as we welcome you back there, just talking about yours and ours relatedness, which is my top domain, and how we first connected 6 years ago in the office about talking about snowboarding and you learning to jump in Whistler, etc. So, and ever since we built that relatedness and that human connectedness by finding common ground, which is what you're alluding to.
Yeah, it's funny, we're both from the Commonwealth, right? And other people may not understand what that means. That, the UK, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, a few other places, there's actually like a kind of bond that we all share. If we're in the Commonwealth, we all have the Queen as our supposed head of state and all this stuff. So, we always feel a sense of relatedness with people from any of that place, which is, is quite funny as well. Yeah. So sorry, some craziness going on in this building right now. I can focus again for the next 20 minutes, but it's been quite a last 90 seconds.
That's totally okay. David, I wanted to shift our attention and conversation, if you don't mind, to a question that I'm getting from the audience. There's a common theme here from quite a few listeners and leaders. And David, that is, can we talk about how SCARF, now that you've given us the outline of SCARF, we have that language. Can we talk about how SCARF shows up in the domain or in the application in the D&I space in organizations? Yeah. It seems to be a very hot topic right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good place to dig in. Look, SCARF is this strange thing that works at all these different levels of scale, because it's really describing, human interactions and what's driving them, right? So, it works at the level of scale of just like understanding and improving our interactions, moment to moment, but also works at the level of scale of, more broadly, like, how to work with someone, but even more broadly, like big changes that are happening in a company or society, right? Mm-hmm. You can study it at a societal level, right? So it's interesting, there's a book I read years ago called The Spirit Level, where this team did more than a decade of research to identify essentially what I call it a fairness quotient. They call it an equity value or something, but they look at inequity in different states and also in different countries. And what they did was they then looked at health outcomes, and they found a really strong correlation. It's essentially, the more kind of unfairness there is in a society, the worse the health outcomes are. And it turns out to be for everyone, not just people in the kind of lower areas of the social status, socioeconomic status. So, everyone's affected negatively in all sorts of ways. And so this occurs, these ideas occur all the way to, whole societies as well. But when it comes to DEI, one of the things to understand is that, if you feel treated unfairly, it's activating real, responses in your brain and your body that is reducing immune system. Literally it can affect your decision making. It can reduce, you make more mistakes, all sorts of things. So, feeling like you're treated unfairly is really difficult, right? But so is feeling like you're not very high status and you're a lower status, right? So you get that effect, right? And so is not feeling like you have much control in the world, right? So throughout history, there's been this stratification of society, where people at the top get all sorts of resources and status and other things, and others do not. And there's a brilliant book that's terrifying and deeply disturbing in many ways, called Caste, that kind of describes this and describes how this has happened across time, across history. Not to devalue the African American experience or others in any way. It's like we seem to do this as humans and have done for a long, long time, and it's it's really, really difficult for the folks who are not the higher status groups to really kind of live as well. I mean, it literally is harder. So there's that. So bringing this back to SCARF as well, what we found, we did some research years ago to identify, like, we did some research to work out the foundations of bias in a similar way that SCARF identifies the foundations of motivation, right? And as we did this bias work, we came out with this amazing framework, SEEDS, which I talked about a few weeks ago. But putting SEEDS out into the world, and it's as useful as SCARF. It's a little bit not quite as kind of intuitive, but it's just as sticky. As we did this, we kind of had all these people saying, "What about inclusion? What about inclusion?" Bias is great. What about inclusion? So we started this big research project on inclusion. One of the first things we did was just look at all the statements people make when they feel included or excluded. So looking at all the language. So we did this kind of huge data sort of, what do people say when they're feeling, excluded? And literally it took like 5 minutes to notice that every single one of those, it was like thousands, every single one of those categorized really perfectly into SCARF. Like every single one was either fairness or status or autonomy or certainty. There's a couple here and there that could have been, others. And we're like, oh, SCARF again. We didn't mean to like say inclusion with SCARF, but it's so clear that inclusion is positive SCARF. It's so unbelievably clear that inclusion is positive SCARF. And so, but then we sort of had this insight, like it's really hard to teach people 5 things. And so we simplified that into a framework where you've got to start with relatedness. Like you've got to have this shared goal or nothing else kind of matters. Right. And so with relatedness, we kind of simplified that to find common ground as the habit. And then we said, all right, we sort of think status and fairness go together, right? In some ways. So we said, how do we turn this into 3 habits, not 5? So find common ground, and then it became lift people up, and then it became help create clarity for autonomy and certainty. And so this kind of became the inclusion mantra. If you're going to be inclusive, here are the 3 things you most need to do. Find common ground, lift people up, help create clarity. And that's been taught to literally millions of people. And it may sound simple, but we have this different hypothesis about organizational change. The dominant hypothesis about organizational change is, the top-down hypothesis, right? Take the few people at the top and take a few people and teach them, teach a few people a lot slowly, right? Because it ends up being slow. If you've got 100 top leaders, it takes a long time to get them to experience some learning, right? So the dominant hypothesis for kind of organizational change, leadership development is teach a few people a lot of things slowly, right? We turn that on its head, and we think, and you see this in systems theory, it jumps out at you. We'd rather teach everyone just a few things quickly, right? And so if you can get this idea, find common ground, lift people up, help create clarity. If you can get this idea into everyone all at once, you can actually see profound change, because you've got just a few people doing, you've got a lot of people doing a simple thing, all at the same time. And it turns out that whether we do something or not depends largely on how much we think other people are actually doing it. So inclusion for us is SCARF, but we simplified it into these different domains. Now, SCARF and SEEDS are 2 really important things to understand if you're going to be a DEI practitioner. There's a lot of other things to understand, there's no question. But kind of what drives people and what creates bias. To be a DEI practitioner and in an organization and not like really understand those 2 things is kind of, from my perspective, you're missing a big opportunity. So we've been talking about this the last month or so. We've launched a masterclass for internal DEI practitioners, and I emphasize internal because it's people in companies. We're not at this point doing something for externals. but we're running this masterclass. So people who want to understand our perspective on DEI overall, and certainly learning scarf and seeds in the context of inclusion and allyship and speaking up, and a bunch of other things is one piece of it, but there's a lot of other pieces, like how do you mobilize leaders? How do you design change initiatives that really work? How do you, install systems? But scarf is kind of this language that just shows up in so many places. Like, it shows up in inclusion, but it also shows up in, trying to get people to speak up. It shows up in allyship. It shows up in how you assess people. It shows up in all performance conversations. So it's like this base language that shows up in all these different applications. And so, yeah. So anyway, my team will probably put a link in, but we just opened registration, I think Monday, for that program. And it is application, so you have to actually apply. Not everyone's accepted, but we're excited about the community that's coming together to spend 3 months, really studying the neuroscience of DEI. And SCARF will be a piece of it, but as I said, many other things as well.
Yeah, thanks, David. I see that Evan from our team has just posted that in the chat. So folks, for those of you that are listening, please have a look at that hyperlink there. Thank you. So David, as I listen to the vast application of SCARF, not just in the D&I space, and return back to work, hybrid workplace, knowing that we have 9 minutes left here, there's a couple of things that, when I think about the application of SCARF across over 5 million leaders globally that we've managed to touch, right? A lot of leaders,
year, by the way, that was last year. Probably not all of them learned SCARF. I would say last year, probably 2 or 3 million people learned SCARF through us. Yeah.
Right. And in those conversations we've had with them, David, what I've noticed is there's this frequent pattern that's emerged where leaders are saying they recognize this tool can be used as a common language with their teams, right? So that it can be used in a metacognitive way. And that metacognition, we always talk about this, David, is that human ability to think about our thinking when in the moment, right? In the here and now. And SCARF allows us to do some of that introspective thinking, right? I'm noticing I'm closing off from this conversation. There's a threat. What domain of SCARF is at play here? Why? And then what do I need to do to offset that? And then I can do that for teams too. So just noticing those patterns in multiple ways we can apply them. David, I know that we're running short on time and we're about to go into a poll, but I'm wondering if you can just share, just as we close, any funny stories you have that may come to mind.
Lots.
You see in SCARF applied. What
lots.
Maybe short and briefly.
Maybe Shelby can put up the poll so before people jump off that we know how to support them. And I'll kind of tell a couple of stories and then we'll let people get back to work. There's a lot of things. I mean, I always get kind of a kick when someone emails me and says, "Oh my God, you've appeared in my class." So SCARF is in some textbooks that we approved in some schools, and I get the kind of these bizarre things, and I'll get a relative or friend saying, "Get out of my head, I'm learning SCARF in this class." It's always funny. But it's, the spookiest thing, I think this is not a funny story, it's a spooky story, I was just like, I was doing some research recently about kind of trying to explain the impact that SCARF has, because it's one of these things that we call it disruptive language. Like once you learn it, you can't unlearn it, and it's a filter through which you see everything. It's like if you were learning to cook and you discovered salt and you never knew about it before. It's like, you're never going to forget that salt makes things better, but don't use too much, right? Like it's disruptive. Every time you see salt, you know it, So SCARF is like that, and seeds is as well. But I was trying to explain to a company why it's kind of so sticky and helpful. Because essentially they were saying, we don't need to pay for this. It's like, I was like, look, when we run a program and we ask people for, the 3 things they're still using, months later, SCARF is always in those 3. And when I say still using, using every week, tell us the 3 things you still think about every week that changes your behavior. SCARF's always in those 3, even when the SCARF's only a small part of a bigger program. And we've just recently opened up the ability for companies to license, just the SCARF model, for example. If they want to weave it into, their own stuff, they can do that. Same with seeds. So we were trying to kind of, explain this. So I was looking around and saying, look, what's another big thing that, everyone really knows and uses. And it was, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We've all, everyone knows that. So I said, look, let's see, Maslow must have this huge number. Maybe SCARF's got 10% of that. And that's really, fascinating. Well, I've done the search more than 10 times and it freaks me out, but SCARF has a lot more links on the web than Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Depending how you search, like a factor of 10 sometimes, like a lot more. It's kind of spooky. But it's one of these things that's central to D&I, but it's also central to being a good parent. It's central, absolutely central to being a good team manager, first-time manager, mid-manager, senior leader, CEO. Also really relevant to just designing initiatives, changing humans in any way. If you're in the business of trying to make people better in some way, you're butting up against SCAR. So there's a lot to say. We can have a further conversation down the track, maybe about some of the nuance, but it's been great to tell the story, a little bit of excitement, to have a massive bit of uncertainty and lack of autonomy in the middle of it. But thanks for the opportunity to share this, Matt. Thanks for the great questions. Thanks to everyone for being here. And I'll hand back to, we'll hand back to Shelby for some quick announcements. But thanks for the opportunity to share this. And everyone, take care of yourselves, look after each other, and keep doing what matters. Bye-bye.
Thanks, David. Let's go back to Shelby. Thanks, Shelby.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much for today's discussion. It was very lively. Please take a look and let us know how NLI can help you in the future. This poll will stay up for a few more moments. We have some quick announcements to roll through. So for the masterclass, as a reminder, we're still accepting applications for it. If you're a DEI practitioner at an organization, you'll benefit from our coursework and community sessions as we explore neuroscience of DEI. Learn more and apply at neuroleadership.com/DEI. So check that out if you're interested. We also have a survey. If you're welcome to share your thoughts with us, we'd love to hear that. The team will be sharing that link in the chat. Insider exchange, specifically for our senior executives. If you enjoy your Brain at Work Live, we would think that you'd be great for our insider program. We invite you to join this exclusive community so you can hear about new research, have roundtable discussions with our executives and researchers, and help us craft new innovations. So to apply, follow the link that we are also dropping. Product demos. We will have a product demo next week on Focus for Wednesday, May 18th at noon Eastern time. So if you're interested in learning more, make sure that you sign up for that product demo. We're hiring too. So if you're interested in working on our side and doing opportunities with us, visit neuroleadership.com/careers to learn more about our open positions. Summit 2023, we're going to keep reminding you, we're already jumping into working on this, so make sure that you keep your eyes open. We will be sharing new information later this year. And if you enjoyed today's conversation and want to share it out, you'll love our podcast. So check wherever you listen to your podcast for your Brain at Work Live, and it will be available for you next week. And this is where we officially say farewell. So on behalf of our guest and NLI today, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you here next week, and have a great weekend. We'll leave this up for a few moments so you can talk, check out the poll still, and ask us any questions if you have them.